By the summer of 1943, by the late spring, early summer, these tensions had escalated, and OUNB, or now known as the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, started attacking Polish settlements. This is where that Volynian massacre started, and really throughout the month of July accelerated enormously. Taras Bulba was observing what was happening. He refused to take part in it. He also wrote to OUNB that what they were doing was reprehensible. He argued that for the first thing, that the Poles and the Ukrainians were both occupied nations. They should cooperate against the occupiers, the Soviets and the Germans together. And then any differences between the two could be settled after the war. But for the duration of the war, they should be allied. He also argued that the massacres on the Poles made the Ukrainians look like so-called hatchet men, as hatchets were very much used as weapons in these massacres against the Poles, and that with the reputation as hatchet men, they would only be seen as bloody murderers and not as state builders. And Taras Bulba argued that support from the Western allies would be crucial, as he believed that the Germans would lose the war, and that the Western allies would be able to advance far into Eastern Europe, and they would have a saying in what happens after the war with Poland and Ukraine. Naturally, the OUNB, or the Bandera Insurgent Army, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, by now they absolutely didn't listen to him. Instead, they also started attacking his units, the units of Taras Bulba, and those units of OUNM under Melnik that were still under his command. Quickly, they started subordinating all those units under them, and because of that, some of those units that previously had been part of the so-called Bulbovцы now started participating in the massacres on the Poles in the region as well. This is where really everything shatters, and by August there is an attack on the headquarters of Taras Bulba and his organization. He himself was not captured, but his wife was captured, a Czech woman, kidnapped for a month and finally hung and murdered. So there was definitely a break between Taras Bulba and the Banderovci, so to say, the men of Stepan Bandera, or the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. At that time, Taras Bulba realized that he had to flee the field. He had lost against the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, and instead he went to Warsaw to try to negotiate some kind of agreement with the Germans and go back into German service. Instead, the Germans arrested him and sent him to Sachsenhausen, a concentration camp, where at the time Stepan Bandera was also imprisoned, but also the leader of the Polish underground military organization, the Home Army, Armia Krajowa, Stefan Grot-Rowecki. So they were all imprisoned at the same place. After a year in that prison, the Germans, now under even more pressure from the Soviet Red Army, decided to set Taras Bulba free. They let him organize an organization of around 500 men, and they were supposed to be parachuted into behind enemy lines, behind the Soviet Red Army. However, that never came to fruition, those plans, and instead Taras Bulba and his men quickly requested to be transferred instead from the Eastern Front to the Western Front to fight against the Allies. They believed that if they would be captured by the Soviet Red Army, that would mean imminent death. Would they be captured by the Allies, at least they would survive. The Germans agreed, and instead Taras Bulba and his men started fighting on the Western Front. They finally surrendered to the Allies in May 1945 and were interned in Rimini in Italy. Taras Bulba, later there were some apologies. Later Taras Bulba, he lived in Germany for a while, then moved to the US, There he was active for a while. Later on, moved to Canada, where he wrote his memoirs. But by 1981, he died of old age, and that was the end of the story of Taras Bulba. So, not everybody were participating in the massacres on the Poles.
No, well, that's been a fascinating story, and that's come to end just at the right point. So, thank you very much indeed for sharing that with us, Adam. Amazing stuff, and of course, a lesson, I think, in many cases, that war acquires its own momentum, and when folks set out to start a war, that what happens during the war is often very different. The Second World War, of course, is a good example of which that was a part. Very different from how you imagine it. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the war between Russia and Ukraine might indeed itself lead to rather stranger results. But that remains to be seen anyway. Thank you for sharing that with us. There we are, a very interesting story for Adam of a very interesting character. The dislocation of war causing all sorts of problems for those involved directly, those involved indirectly, and people having to make very difficult decisions. And it's very easy for us, with the benefit of hindsight, to say, well, we would have done it differently, we would have decided differently. I'm not so sure. It's hard to understand the pressure individuals were under. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Poland Daily History.